Good morning, everyone.
Please go ahead, Jay.
Thanks, Reyes. Yes, good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the stakeholder call to discuss the issue paper and straw proposal for the Interconnection Process Enhancements 2021 initiative. This effort is being led by Danielle Table from our policy group. I'm also joined by Bob Emmert and Linda Wright from our Interconnection Resources group, Steve Ruddy from our Grid Assets group, Bill Weaver from our legal group, and Debbie Levine and Jason Foster from our Infrastructure Contracts and Management group. On the next slide, we have, as most, if not all of you by now are hopefully familiar with, a typical display of our stakeholder process. As mentioned, we are at the beginning stages of this initiative, with this being the issue paper and straw proposal discussion, after which we will use your input to further shape how this proposal ultimately becomes finalized so that we can carry it forth to our Board of Governors and AIM governing body for consideration for approval, after which we'll then file with FERC and hopefully, if approved, would then move on to our implementation stage, and after which we'll codify those changes within our stakeholder training and business practice manuals. And as most are also familiar by now, this call, as most of our calls, are recorded for stakeholder convenience, allowing those who are unable to attend to listen to the recordings following the meetings. Those recordings will be publicly available on the webpage for a limited time following the meeting, and we please request that the recordings and any related transcriptions not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. And on the next slide, you should see the agenda for today. We'll be taking questions throughout, so please be sure to raise your hand virtually to enter the question queue. You can do that by selecting the virtual raise hand icon that you should notice at the top right of your screen. And then you just click it to enter the queue, and then once you're finished with your comment, you would click it again to exit the queue. Sometimes folks get confused whether they should keep it up or not. But if we see a hand up, we just assume that someone's question is still there, so just FYI. If you dialed in separately by phone, however, please push #2 to enter the queue. And we prefer verbal questions, but if we see anything in the chat, I know some people prefer the chat function. We'll also monitor for those and verbalize those for folks as well. After Danielle goes through the introduction and background for us, we'll then move on to the section over moving resources through the interconnection queue more efficiently, potentially more quickly, followed by managing the overheated queue prior to our lunch break. And then in the afternoon, we'll pick up with other residual issues and, of course, stakeholder suggested issues before concluding with next steps. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Danielle.
Thanks, Jimmy. We can go ahead and move to the next slide. So the next couple slides I wanted to touch on really serve as a high-level introduction to this initiative, and then the rest of the presentation gets into the real meat of the issues that are outlined in the issue paper straw proposal that was published last week. So let's go ahead and move to the next slide. Thanks. So the Interconnection Process Enhancements Initiative, or as we like to call it, the IPE, is the ISO's ongoing commitment to continuous improvement to the generator interconnection and deliverability allocation procedures by making appropriate process enhancements as the environment for resource interconnection evolves. The 2021 IPE is really seeking to explore issues, solutions to issues that fall into three main buckets. The first, and probably the most important, is addressing the fact that we need to meet the challenges facing timely, effective, reliable, and economic resource and transmission development over the next decade. This really relies on improving coordination across all fronts related to transmission and resource planning occurring at the ISO, but also occurring at state agencies. The second bucket is focused on resolving issues and creating enhancements to handle the accelerated pace of resource procurement and development needed over the next 5 to 10 years that may not align with the current interconnection processes. And this area focuses on considering some broader reforms to align our interconnection process with procurement activities that may be conducted on a one-off or long-term basis. And finally, the third bucket is focused on issues that we're aware of and need to be enhanced or adjusted based on current circumstances since the last IPE initiative in 2018. Before we move to the next slide, I think it's also very important to note here that we don't intend to address any of these buckets of issues in isolation. We think of all of these issues needing to be addressed in coordination with each other in order to achieve a sustainable approach to resolving the issues for the long term. Let's move to the next slide. Thanks. So given the current supply conditions and unprecedented procurement orders for the next 5 years, we've determined that this initiative will have two distinct but simultaneously run phases. Phase 1 will focus on near-term enhancements to the existing interconnection processes that we can resolve, particularly related to the current queue overload compounded by cluster 14. This phase will be targeting a completion before summer 2022, and we'll be going to the Board of Governors in May 2022. And phase 2 will focus on resolving the longer-term modifications and broader reforms to align interconnection processes with procurement activities. These modifications and process reform considerations will work to achieve greater efficiencies, as well as use of valuable planning and engineering expertise, and also reduce uncertainty in the development processes. We're targeting a completion of this phase before the start of the Cluster 15 process in April 2023. We'll be bringing that phase to the Board of Governors in November 2022. So I'll note that on each slide going forward, you'll find a note indicating which issue falls in each phase. And at the very end of this presentation, there are a couple slides outlining the entire scope of the issues we're seeking to develop proposals for in phase 1 and phase 2. So with that, let's go ahead and move to the next set of slides that are focused on issues related to moving resources through the interconnection queue more efficiently and potentially more quickly. And what I'll do is that as I go through each slide, I'll explain the slide, explain our proposal and rationale, and then I'll pause for questions at the end of each slide. So let's go ahead and move to the next slide. Thanks, Jimmy. So related to removing the downsizing window and simplifying downsizing request requirements, our initial thinking was we wanted to propose to transition from an annual month-long open window for receiving downsizing requests and allow them to be submitted at any time. We heard from a number of stakeholders who supported an expedited process for downsizing projects that had no impacts on other projects, possibly using the material modification assessment or the MMA process as the process for determining impacts. And based on that feedback, we are proposing to simplify the downsizing process, which currently encompasses about 6 pages of Appendix DD in the CAISO tariff. So we're proposing to remove the downsizing application window, the unique downsizing deposit, and the downsizing agreement, which is Appendix HH. Instead, the downsizing process will be modified to allow downsizing requests to be submitted at any time and be processed through an MMA-like process, which stakeholders suggested. Once this downsizing request is received by the CAISO, the project would then be deemed downsized to the requested capacity, and those projects that have no network upgrades would be approved through the MMA process, and GIA would be amended. This simplification of the downsizing process will really enable the interconnection customers to right-size their projects more easily and with less administrative burden for all parties. So we think this is a viable proposal going forward. So we are proposing to address this issue within the scope of phase 1 near-term enhancements. And with that, I'll pause and see if there's any questions. Looks like we have a couple already in the queue.
Yes, I do see a couple of callers in the queue. Moving on to the first caller. Caller, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Oh, yeah. Hi, this is Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I had just a couple of questions. So it seems like if a project, under this proposal, if a project has network upgrades, then basically they're gonna get their answer, the results about the time that they would have under the current timeline, right? Does it normally comes out around the reassessment time for downsizing?
Yes, I believe that's correct.
Okay.
Susan, this is Bob. Yeah, we'll still be utilizing the reassessment process for studying downsize projects that have network upgrades for determination if those network upgrades are still needed.
Okay. Okay. So the issue is this: there'd be simplified administrative procedures, but the timing would for those projects would be the same.
That's correct.
Okay. Have you considered whether if a project has network upgrades, but they're solely assigned to that project, sometimes that happens, whether they might still be able to use the MMA process?
Well, I think it'll be an MMA-like process, and we'll be reviewing the projects as they come in, and we'll be making the determination based off of information we have and whether they can move forward without being studied or not. So I anticipate all projects will go through that kind of a initial review for determination of the path that project needs to take.
Okay, so if it's possible that if they have network upgrades and perhaps they're either solely assigned to that project or you can easily determine an impact without going through the reassessment, that perhaps they might still be able to use that MMA-like process?
Well, I think the best way to answer it is this case-by-case basis, up to the engineers to determine.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's all I had.
I do not see any further callers in the queue as of now.
Okay, great. Let's go ahead and move to the next slide then. So this slide is focused on the issue of should the transmission plan deliverability or TPD allocation process revisions be considered. Our intent with this proposal or this issue was really that the TPD allocation process has worked well since it was first initiated for cluster 5, but with the trend of very large numbers of interconnection requests submitted in recent clusters, we've requested additional input on potential revisions or enhancements to this allocation process as part of this IPE initiative. And so of the stakeholders that commented on this topic, there was near universal opposition to a process of allocating TPD to LSEs, but there were a limited number of comments recommending more limited adjustments to the TPD allocation process. So based on the feedback we received, we're proposing to revise the existing allocation process as follows. Number 1, we'll be eliminating allocation group 3, proceeding without a PPA. So of all the projects that have used this and the previous similar classification for obtaining TPD, we're really only aware of one project that's actually achieved commercial operation without a PPA. So we think that by removing group 3, we clarify that generators and their PPAs must directly support resource adequacy obligations going forward. The second thing that we're proposing to do is simplify the allocation groups by combining various groups by the following methodology. So group 1 would include any active interconnection request demonstrating it has executed PPA requiring FCDS, or the interconnection customer is a LSC serving its own load. Group 2 would include any active interconnection request demonstrating its currently shortlisted for a PPA or actively negotiating a PPA. And the third is any energy-only project that's achieved commercial operation. And we think that by consolidating the groups, we're simplifying the process and actually rewarding the projects certain or most likely to support resource adequacy regardless of where they are in the queue. And at the same time, the new Group 3 may reward the rare project that is already online without deliverability, allowing an off-taker to immediately add the generator to its portfolio. Further, we're proposing to make adjustments to the GitApp CPM section 6.2.9.4, which defines the process where points are allotted to projects based on the project's maturity in areas such as their PPA, permitting, and land acquisition. And we're also proposing to clarify the requirement related to a PPA requiring deliverability. The intent of constructing deliverability network upgrades and allocating deliverability is to allow the facility to participate in the RA program. So we're proposing to revise the tariff to clarify that in the future, a PPA must be with an off-taker to fulfill its own RA obligation. In other words, the PPAs of off-takers that do not have RA obligations will not be eligible for groups 1 or 2 as defined above. And finally, we are proposing to eliminate all TPD retention criteria except that those projects that received an allocation in Group 2 must submit an executed PPA by November 30th of the year that the allocation was received. We believe that eliminating all of the retention criteria except for the shortlist to the PPA requirement is reasonable because ultimately any non-viable project attempting to retain deliverability while lingering in the queue will face commercial viability criteria. And further, the retention criteria is an administrative burden for not only the ISO, but also customers, and it's more likely to result in false positives than meaningful deliverability retention. So we believe this is a reasonable proposal to revise the TPD allocation process. This is in scope for phase 1, the near-term enhancements. And with that, I know that's a lot of information, so I'll give stakeholders a minute to digest, and let's go ahead and take some questions. I see we've got 3 folks in the queue already.
Yes. Just a reminder that you'll hear a beep tone when your line is unmuted. So after that, you can go ahead and ask your question. Moving on to the very first caller. Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hi, this is Song Zhu from Greybright, representing Calware. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Sangju.
Okay. Just a question. So Group 1 and 2 are for active IR. So our understanding is once a project achieves COD, it's no longer considered active IR. So our question is why EU project that's already operational, that has an execute PPA, requires deliverability can't compete in Group 1. So we have seen a real instance this happened. It's ready, and the capacity is ready and available to be used. So why should it be put in the last group to compete for the deliverability?
Sanjay, this is Bob. I think that's really our intention, and that's a clarification that we need to make. So if you could include that in your comments, that would be helpful.
Okay.
Moving on to the next caller. Caller, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Yeah, hi, Susan Schneider, Venus Consulting. I have a question, but I wanted to follow up on your discussion with Sanjay just now. So what you're saying is if an energy-only project that's achieved commercial operation were to obtain a PPA requiring deliverability, they could come back and ask for deliverability, say, in Group 1. or even 2 if they're shortlisted?
I think that's the intent of our proposal, yes.
Okay, great. Thanks. That's very
This is Bill. I agree.
Thank you. Okay, great. Okay, but my question has to do with the requirement that the PPA must be with the off-taker to fulfill its own obligation. So I have a couple questions about that. One of them is, let's say a project in the upcoming allocation has a PPA with an off-taker requiring RA, but it isn't to fulfill their own obligation. Like when sometimes they're called commercial industrial, PPAs with Amazon or Google or whoever. And so if they were to be get, say, a group 2 allocation and be shortlisted for that kind of PPA, and then the next time around, would they be able to have executed that PPA in order to and still qualify for the allocation, even though it's not for fulfilling the off-taker's own obligation? Was that clear?
This is Bill. I could take a shot at that. I mean, yes, it was clear. I think the answer is yes. That would fulfill. It would have to be. I think trying to change it midstream would be a little too close to retroactive.
Right. Okay. All right. And then my other question was, I understand there's some arrangements where there could be a PPA with an entity that doesn't have an RA obligation. Let's just call it Amazon, just for discussion of this, this discussion. But if Amazon has an agreement with a load serving entity to sell the RA to them for their obligation, so it's my understanding that the CAISO might allow connecting the dots, connecting those dots. Would that still continue to be allowed under this rule?
Yeah, this is I'll take it again. I think it'd have to be a very strong connection where we've matched the generator name, the capacity, the technology, but I don't think we're prepared to say no at this point.
Okay, so presumably it would have to meet sort of the same requirements as if the contract was with the off-taker itself. That same kind of commitment is what you'd be looking for.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks. That's all I had. Appreciate it.
Moving on to the next caller. Caller, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hey, folks. It's Mark Smith of Calpine. Are you explicitly excluding any projects to get an allocation of deliverability that are going to be balance sheet financed? So, for instance, a project that upgrades an existing interconnection by 50 megawatts or 100 megawatts could not receive deliverability unless that incremental capacity has a PPA?
Well, this is Bill, I guess. If I answered the fun questions, I'll answer the bad ones too. I think that is yes what we're proposing, Mark, that it would need to be shortlisted or have a PPA first, or it would need to come online before it could get deliverability.
And could that be a short-term RA contract instead of a full-blown 10-year PPA?
I don't think we've thought about that. If you could submit that in your comments, it'll give us a chance to consider.
Okay. Thanks, Bill.
Thanks, Mark.
Okay, I do not see any further callers in the queue as of now.
Okay, great. Go ahead and move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So this next issue is focused on how can the interconnection process and procurement activity align with transmission system capabilities and renewable generation portfolios developed for planning purposes. Our intention with this was really to figure out that the transmission planning process that the ISO oversees includes a framework for developing policy-driven transmission associated with state policy needs and direction. However, that policy direction in the TPP is not coordinated with interconnection requests seeking to utilize the capacity as it's being developed, nor with the procurement activities of the large number of LSCs now having to meet procurement obligations. So although we did get some stakeholder feedback on this, we are really seeking more stakeholder input on incorporating this through the transmission planning process. We remain concerned that the lack of coordination among the TPP and policy-driven transmission in particular, the interconnection processes and the LSC's procurement processes, continue to create this opportunity for transmission to be utilized by resources not envisioned in the original policy direction, but actually earlier positioned in the queue. And this results in challenges in meeting the state resource policy goals. So at this time, we're seeking further stakeholder input on two concepts here. The first is the concept of not only developing transmission capacity for planning purposes associated with achieving specific resource development, and two, as a further step, withholding that capacity specifically for policy-driven processes for which it was planned rather than relying on it for any and all interconnection requests received through the request windows. The above, questions that we're asking stakeholders to provide some feedback on could potentially help where new capacity is created or capacity is currently available and not already allocated to resources in the queue, but it would not help where the overheated queue has already resulted in all available and planned capacity being allocated. So depending on the feedback we get from this issue going forward, this may be an issue more appropriately addressed in changes to the TPP itself or in the procurement direction to load serving entities. But we did want to provide stakeholders another opportunity to provide some insight or feedback on these two concepts in particular before we make that determination. So because of that, we are proposing to address this issue within the scope of phase 2 long-term enhancements to allow for more stakeholder discussion and feedback. So I'll pause here, see if there's any questions.
I do see a caller in the queue. Please go ahead, your line is unmuted.
Hi, Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. I had a couple of questions here. It seems like this is based on concern maybe that for either maybe offshore wind or geothermal energy. Is that primarily what you're worried about here?
I can take a stab at this. I don't think it's specific to just those two resource types. I think this is in general a concern that we would like stakeholders feedback on.
Right.
And if you have specific concerns related to those two resources in particular, I would encourage you to include that in your comments.
Well, I guess my question is the CAISO has approved, thousands of megawatts of new transmission over the last few years and not really considered, at least in form like this, reserving it for certain resource types or purposes, and not allowing others to have access to that capacity. So this seems like this is obviously would be a new thing, and so I'm wondering what has raised the ISO's concern about this. Is it those particular technologies more than others, perhaps?
This is Bob. I think part of it as well is just the number of projects that we're seeing procured where there are network upgrades that are required, and we still see some significant number of projects in the queue that have little or no network upgrades required, and those are not being procured. So it's in part driven by that process playing out as well.
Okay, but if you're talking about new transmission capacity, and reserving it for a particular purpose, I'm just trying to draw the line between that and something that, something would actually happen in the allocation or in the interconnection process. It seems like, so you're saying this is not specifically targeted for offshore wind or geothermal?
It's Jeff here. It's as kind of being illustrated is as the queue is increasing and the volume in the queue is increasing, And as the CPUC's IRP portfolios have new, and it could include being geothermal or offshore wind or out-of-state wind, or even in terms of any internal resource specifically that the CPUC identifies in their portfolio that's coming in at the point where the queue is already saturated, and having to manage as to how do you deal with the portfolio from the IRP that may not be aligned with the and the types of resources that are identified in the IRP that are coming in at the time with the queue with as many projects in it in there. So it could be the ones you're identifying, it could be other resources, but it's based upon what's in the IRP portfolio that comes into the transmission planning process.
Okay, all right, I'm going to stop asking. Thanks.
I do not see any further callers in the queue as of now.
Okay, so I guess we can move on. Let's go ahead and move to the next slide, please. Thank you. All right, so this next topic is related to developing a solicitation model for some key locations and constraints not addressed in portfolio development where commercial interest is the primary driver. So we initially raised this issue somewhat generically, and two alternative concepts underpinned the request for stakeholder feedback. The first was a solicitation model to clarify in an overheated area which projects should proceed into the interconnection process, and two, a solicitation model to assess interest in an area in which transmission capacity may be expanded into the planning process, with commitments from resources helping support the transmission development in that area. Based on the stakeholder feedback we received, kind of similar to the last issue presented, there are two concepts that we want to seek further stakeholder feedback on. The first is a solicitation model to seek clarity in an overheated area as to which projects should be carried forward into the interconnection process. And two, a solicitation model to test and confirm interest in an area in which transmission capacity may be expanded. In the planning process, we have mechanisms like the location-constrained resource interconnection facility. And we really expect that these resources would have a pre-existing right to interconnect ahead of other projects. So we'd like to see or hear from more stakeholders on this topic. And as such, we'll be addressing this in the scope of phase 2 so that we can have those longer-term discussions with stakeholders to really figure out if a solicitation model should be considered in these instances. Do we have any questions or comments related to this?
As a reminder, if you're connected to the computer audio or use the Call Me feature in WebEx, you may enter the question queue by using the WebEx raise hand icon located just above the chat panel. You'll hear a beep tone when your line is unmuted. At that time, please state your name and question. If you're just on the phone line and not using the WebEx audio, please dial #2 on your phone to enter the question queue. You'll hear a notification when your line is unmuted. At that time, please state your name and question. I do not see any callers in the queue as of now.
Okay, great. Let's go ahead and move to the next slide. All right, so the next issue was focused on developing an accelerated process for quote-unquote ready projects to be considered. This issue was brought up to assess whether a new accelerated process should be considered for projects that can demonstrate an advanced readiness that would allow them to quickly go into operation relative to other projects. This concept was initially raised in part to address the concern regarding the large volume of resources that are required to be connected to the grid by 2025 and beyond to meet the pressing reliability needs. So initially, we did not specify if this was meant to be discussed in the context of an overlay of sorts onto the existing interconnection process, as opposed to a replacement of the existing processes, but rather we left the door open to see what stakeholders would like going forward. And so we received, the stakeholder feedback we received really fell into three camps. Some folks supported creating an expedited path for the quote-unquote ready projects, especially if these projects contribute to the reliability of the system. Other stakeholders opposed this approach because they pointed out that the CAISO tariff currently has two accelerated processes for projects already, and introducing a third process would be seen as redundant. And then finally, the third bucket of stakeholder comments that we received was asking the CAISO to clarify the readiness criteria. And once the CAISO does so, they could opine on this issue a little bit more clearly. So based on all of that feedback and the challenges to define and validate ready criteria that would be acceptable to the earlier two projects being leapfrogged, at this time, we're not recommending a proposal for long-term access to be based on this approach. However, a framework for urgent reliability-driven interconnection service for interim interconnection is being proposed in its place for stakeholders to comment on. Along the lines of the emergency generation that was put in place this past summer based on the governor's proclamation, we're proposing an emergency process to the extent a potential capacity shortfall is determined by the ISO that requires a proclamation from the governor, and a state agency would need to determine the generators required to meet that capacity shortfall. We would then go ahead and work with the applicable PTO, state agency, and generator to expedite the interconnection process, and the generator would be allowed to interconnect for a maximum of 3 years or a shorter period of time determined by the state. In addition, the emergency generator could be or can be accommodated using existing interconnection service that does not require network upgrades to be built and cannot impact any other third party. So we recognize that this is a change from our original issue. So because of that, we are proposing to address this issue within the scope of phase 2 long-term enhancements to ensure that we have sufficient stakeholder discussion on this item and account for stakeholder feedback. So I'll go ahead and pause here and see if there's any stakeholder questions.
I do see a couple of callers in the queue. Moving on to the first caller, please go ahead, your line is unmuted.
Hi, Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. I just had a question. If a project used this process to connect for just, and given the 3-year timeline or a 3-year maximum interconnection, would that 3 years start from the time that they reach COD?
Susan, this is Deb. Yes, the intention would be it would be 3 years from when they reach COD.
Okay.
Consistent
and if they
with what was done for summer.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
But,
okay. So if
okay.
they wanted to continue to operate after that, could they submit either some kind of extension, or could they submit a regular interconnection request, or what might happen if they want to go beyond 3 years?
Yeah, they would have to submit a regular interconnection request through one of the interconnection processes.
Okay, and if they would have to do that, since it takes about, forgetting about the cluster 14 for a minute, it takes about 2 years or so to do that, 2+ years. They would have to, about 6 months after COD, submit a regular interconnection request if they were going to go through the cluster study process.
That sounds about right, yes.
Okay.
But hopefully it won't be 2.5 years because we're doing this to not have a super cluster again.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Moving on to the next caller. Caller, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Songjie Zhu from Greybright. A question, Daniel mentioned the emergency generator can be accommodated using existing interconnection service. Just want some clarification. Does that mean it has to be capacity behind existing plant or existing interconnection request? So it cannot exceed the interconnection capacity that's already there? Second question is then for those emergency capacity, will they get deliverability through the annual NQC process?
So the intention is similar to what was done this year during the summer. The capacity would have to already be at the interconnection point. And assuming that the project already had deliverability, then they could use the deliverability associated with the project that is already sitting there.
Okay, thank you.
Does that make sense, Sanju?
Yeah, so it means it's not really an expansion of the capacity. It's more like a behind-meter expansion. Is that right?
Yeah, you could look at it that way.
Well,
it's not that they can get additional.
Yeah, Debbie, I think we're talking about two different things. Number one was what Danielle proposed, which is like the summer proposal, which is a new capacity expansion process. Alternatively, in the absence of using that process, all we're saying is you would need to use existing processes like repowering or MMA.
So the proposal here is the new capacity expansion.
Yes.
Okay, so it can go beyond whatever that existing plant has today.
Yes, that's correct, right, Debbie? I mean, it's a new study process to increase interconnection capacity.
You're right.
So then additional deliverability could be granted on a temporary basis?
I think, I don't remember if we said something about that, maybe included in your comments. I think we would certainly be open to interim deliverability at the least.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I believe that's where we ended up, was allowing interim deliverability. And then the project, to the extent that they wanted to stay online and get into the process, could either go for seeking deliverability and or go through the interconnection process to stay online long term and already have the deliverability if they sought it in a previous TPD affidavit process.
Okay, moving on to the next caller. Please go ahead, your line is unmuted.
Hi, this is Carolina Maslanka from the CPSC. I have a couple of questions. One, I just wanted to understand what the distinction is between this specific issue or section of the straw proposal and, for example, I think there are some sections that there seems to be overlap, 3.3, the TPD, some of the group restructuring that's defined there, and I think in the straw proposal there was an outline of factors that should be applied that Vistra proposed that spoke to readiness. So I wanted to know if the ISO sees overlap between those issues or how you're looking at them as distinct issues. That's question number one.
This is Bob. I'll address the TPD allocation process, item 3.3. So no, we don't see overlap of this. This is the item 3.3 is projects that are in the queue, going through the standard process, and it's our standard methodology for allocating TPD to projects going through that standard process.
Okay, and this question is just more broadly to any projects, or?
Well, this part of this item is to help us to understand and define what ready projects are and how to, should we have some unique process for handling those type of projects, which is outside of what our tariff allows at this point.
All right, okay, understood, thank you. And then the other question, it seems like one of the reasons to maybe not pursue defining the readiness criteria further is, you know, as you state here, the challenges associated with leapfrogging. So I wanted to ask if CAISO has really explored those challenges of leapfrogging anywhere specifically that stakeholders can look to understand, you know, what the potential options would look like, and exactly, you know, what the concerns or issues would be to those earlier projects that would be leapfrogged, or if this is just you know, a broad concern that we know exists but hasn't really been explored in detail.
Well, this is Bob, not hearing anybody else jump in. This item was really raised by stakeholders. And so the ISO doesn't necessarily have a vision for exactly how this would proceed. There are challenges, you know, such as you mentioned, leapfrogging, projects in the queue, and those type of issues. So I think the ISO is really in the mode of looking to stakeholders to give us some guidance on what they think would be appropriate for ready projects. What are ready projects? How would we handle them? And, you know, give us some ideas of what you think would be a way to appropriately handle them and ways that wouldn't be.
All right, thank you. That's really helpful. I appreciate it.
Going on to the next caller. Please go ahead, your line is unmuted.
Yeah, hi, Susan Schneider again. I apologize for coming in the second time, but I was a little confused about the discussion you had with Sanjay about new capacity and whether it was new capacity or existing capacity, or is it that you have to have the point of interconnection has to exist, but you can have new capacity at that point of interconnection, or you could have a new point. I apologize. I just didn't kind of get the clarification of whether it could be new capacity or existing, or did it have to be behind an interconnection, or would you mind just clarifying that again? I apologize.
Well, this is Bill. I guess, you know, we do need to
real quick, Bill.
Sure.
We do have this ready component, but we also have included in our proposal to include the process, which is what we utilized for this, you know, dealing with this summer and near-term capacity, where we have allowed under, you know, the governor's proclamation to bring on some additional capacity that we end up going to FERC and asking for a waiver for, to allow for us to do this particular process, to bring on capacity that would last for 3 years and have some limitations on how it could be operated. So we are proposing to make that a bit more permanent in our tariff. So that is one side of it, and that's what Debbie was speaking to. But there's also more broadly this ready process of what we might want to do for those type of projects. So there's kind of two different components we're looking at. And then Bill, if you have more to add.
Well, wait, before you go to Bill. So is the issue that you've mixed the two things together? You've got this whole separate readiness question, which you're not really doing much on right now, and you're not recommending here. But I was asking more of what I thought your proposal was, which is this emergency thing. And so the question for the emergency thing, can you have a new interconnection for that, or does it have to be behind the existing interconnection requests, or what can you just clarify that? That's really more why I was going on it.
Yeah, this is Bill. I mean, it is for new capacity. I think we're going to have to, you know, refine the criteria in the papers as we go forward, but it's likely that, you know, the new capacity would have to come on very quickly, and that's generally going to require an existing site. Now, I don't know if we're going to go as far as requiring that it has to be in an existing site. Maybe not. Maybe storage can just be plugged in a number of places. But rapid deployment will probably be a criteria.
Okay, well, so let's say you had an existing, if you could do a new interconnection quickly, that presumably could work here, right, for that proposal?
I don't think we're saying no at this point, but I think we need to think about it a little more.
Okay, and if you had an existing interconnection for, say, 100 megawatts, and you wanted to add a generator, I'm just going to call it 50 megawatts, could that make your interconnection 150 megawatts?
Yes.
Okay, so you could do new capacity. Okay, and let me ask one more question then. These things that come on and are supposedly for 3 years and maybe using interim deliverability, do they show up in the base cases for future interconnection studies, or are they not? Do they not, because they're technically temporary?
Again, I think we'd have to refine that proposal going forward. In the case of what we did this summer, the answer is definitely no.
Okay, but it's possible that depending on where this goes in this initiative, perhaps they might be included in.
Yeah, maybe. Like especially if we think everyone is just going to immediately submit a real interconnection request that follows, and they're just going to end up as real generators at the end of their 3-year. I mean, then it would make sense to start planning for them. Well, but it's something we can think about.
Well, wouldn't they, if they submit a new interconnection request, would they have a leg up on other people in their same cluster since they're already connected? As far as priority, I'm trying to figure out, would they be in their own base case, or what? How does that even work?
No, I mean, I guess no, we would treat them the same. So maybe we wouldn't include in the base case. Like I said, I think we need to think about this a little more. It's a good question.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
I do not see any further callers in the queue as of now.
Okay, great. And I think just one thing I wanted to note, because it came up in the last conversation, is that what we're presenting here today is just the issue paper straw proposal. We're still in the very early stages of policy development here. So I want to keep that in mind. And we are seeking further stakeholder feedback on all of these proposals to help us refine the proposals going forward. And especially for the phase 2 issues, these are long-term enhancements, and we want to respect stakeholders' feedback going forward. So we're not committing to any proposal right now, but we want to enhance the development from here on out. So I just want to remind stakeholders of where we're at in the development process. Go ahead and move to the next slide. So I did want to bring up a few of the items that we included in the preliminary issue paper that we have removed from the initiative scope based on the lack of stakeholder support. So the first one deals with streamlining interconnection studies. And after reviewing stakeholder comments, there was some support for looking for ways to streamline the interconnection study process, but only if the standard 2-year cycle can be maintained and doesn't impact the phase 1 cost protections currently in place. Any significant streamlining of the study process would most likely have impacts on current cost protections. And as such, we really don't have any substantial proposals to address this at this time. So we're proposing to remove it from the scope of the initiative, especially as the excessive queue volume addressed in various other topics in this initiative could cover this. So, but I will mention that based on the comments received on this topic, as well as suggestions made by Southern California Edison in the October 19th stakeholder workshop, and subsequent comments provided by other stakeholders on SCE's presentation, there are some process and study content and timeline adjustments that can be further explored in this initiative, which we'll get into later on in this presentation. The second item that we're proposing to remove from the scope is should a one-time framework be adopted to allow resources such as storage to be added to existing sites on an expedited basis, despite potential impacts on earlier queued projects to meet pressing reliability needs? And because we already have the material modification assessment, or the MMA, as well as the post-COD modification process that allows the addition of storage to existing projects, and we also allow the transfer of deliverability through the same process, having an additional one-time framework for this is really not necessary to be considered at this time. So we're proposing to remove this topic from the initiative going forward. The third item that we're removing is related to, should there be incentives for LSEs to procure generation projects at locations where transmission capacity has been built or approved based on the California PUC's portfolios. So in response to stakeholder comments where the majority of stakeholders really did not support this, we'll be removing this topic from the scope, and instead we'll continue to explore means to communicate transmission capacity as an advantage to the development of viable projects through channels outside of the interconnection process itself. And finally, the last item we'll be removing from the scope of the initiative for this specific section of the initiative is related to how can the interconnection process and incoming applications better align with procurement interest? And based on stakeholder feedback, there was really no consensus position on how the interconnection process and upcoming applications could better align with the procurement interest. So given that, we're going to remove the item from the scope of the initiative, and other issues will be continued to explore. We will continue to explore in the context of maintaining and improving the efficacy of the coordination between different processes, working with state agencies as well as state government. So with that, I'll go ahead and pause here and see if there's any questions before we move to the next major area of issues. All right, hearing none. So I think we can go ahead and move on. I'm going to pass the mic over to Bob, who will cover managing the overheated queue.
Right. Thank you, Danielle. So let's move to the next slide. So this item is related to should higher fees, deposits, and other criteria be required for submitting IRs. This is, again, as Danielle said, really related to the overheated queue that we've seen for cluster 14. And as well, we've proposed some things that we think are just timely based on costs that we have seen for doing studies and other data that we've seen within our process. So in this, the ISO is proposing to increase the study deposit from $150,000 to $250,000 per interconnection request. And we're proposing to further increase the study deposit for a parent company or an entity that submits more than 2 interconnection requests in a cluster window, to where a $250,000 deposit would be for first 2 projects submitted by a parent company or entity, increasing to $500,000 per project for projects in the 3 to 5 interconnection request range, and then increasing to $1 million for an interconnection request by a single entity for more than 5 projects. We're also proposing to increase the site exclusivity deposit requirements for in lieu of site exclusivity for to a point where for small generators of 20 megawatts or less of $250,000, which currently is $100,000 now, it'll increase to $250,000. And then for large projects, it will increase to $500,000 for generators over 200 megawatts, or excuse me, 20 megawatts. And associated with that, we are proposing that if an interconnection project withdraws after the interconnection request is deemed complete, 50% of the in lieu of site exclusivity deposit would be non-refundable. And this item is included in phase 2. So with that, I'll stop and ask for questions.
I do see a couple of callers in the queue. Moving on to the first caller, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Yeah, hi, Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. I have a few questions about this. It seems like you have the sentiment behind this is a feeling that developers that submit multiple interconnection requests somehow have not thought them well through, or they're not as well considered, or not as successful perhaps, or withdraw more frequently than developers that submit, say, just 1 or 2 proposals. Is that sentiment seems to come through loud and clear, but is that a correct reading of the feeling behind this idea of escalating study deposits with the number of interconnection requests?
I would say yes, in part. The paper has a table with some data in it where we saw some number of entities putting in very large amounts of interconnection requests. So we felt that there were some entities that were pretty much blasting in a lot of projects, looking for the best project and using our process to determine what really the best project location would be. So that is in part our thinking behind this.
Do you have any evidence that entities that submit large quantities of projects or that somehow have a lower success percentage, or I'm not sure how to say this exactly, but that they have that a bunch of the projects go away, or that they have less success at bringing them to fruition at the end than entities that submit, say, something like 1 to 3 or something like that? Have you looked at that?
I don't think we have enough data. Cluster 14 is obviously something that is a very new phenomenon. And while we had a large cluster 13, it's a bit early in the process to really make any determination on that one as well. So I don't know that we can say we have strong data to be able to determine that. And I don't know that I don't think we have done any real in-depth analysis to try to figure that out, because it would have to do it over a more significant period of time. And I don't think we've seen this issue quite so dramatically as we have in the last couple of clusters, particularly cluster 14.
Okay, but so you don't know really if companies submits a large number of data requests might simply have a system, or perhaps be larger companies that were more able to put valid interconnection requests together, and you don't really know that.
Yeah, I think time will tell, of how this plays out for cluster 14, but I think we have some anecdotal data based on scoping meetings and so forth about how, really the true readiness of those projects and somewhat the reason why so many projects were put in by certain entities. So I think we can speculate on that, and I think we have some level of belief that project entities that put in so many projects, we're not going to see that level of success. For someone that's putting in 30 projects.
Okay, and so, but you don't have any evidence that their proposals are any less valid or less solid, for example, or anything like that, than entities that put in just 1 or 2.
I don't think we have any strong evidence at this point.
Okay, and do you have? Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead. Let me let you finish.
Well, as I said, this is Bill. I mean, I think so. It's like, why are we proposing this? Well, because we are trying to keep the queue at a reasonable number. And the 2 things we don't want to do are, we don't want just a hard cap on a developer by developer basis, because it could be that a developer really has, a dozen very good projects. And if it's willing to pay the higher amount, then that's fine. And we don't want to just raise the deposit requirements for everyone and crush smaller new developers, making it easier for the large developers. So this is kind of the middle ground, reasonable approach to try to, disincentivize just so many interconnection requests.
Okay, and the study deposit. Now the cost. I think you did a study. when you made the study deposits 150,000, which because they used to be 250, you had done you had looked at it at the time, and I think your average study was like 156,000 for the phase 1 and phase 2 studies and the associated things that had to happen with them. So to put in $1 million for a study deposit for a study that normally costs around 150,000, it seems odd to just put that in a study deposit, because the study deposit is supposed to cover your study costs, and I don't think. Have you ever seen $1 million study cost?
That figure, the $1 million, that's unrelated to what the study costs. So yeah, maybe we should call it something else, but
it is called the study deposit. That's
really.
why it seems odd. Another reason why it seemed odd. Yeah. Okay. All right. I'm done. But thank you. I appreciate your candidness on this.
Moving on to the next caller. Caller, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Sandra Zhu from Greybright. Can we have just one comment on this? Could ISO consider a similar treatment as the study deposit for the site exclusivity deposit? So like for the first 2 projects submitted in the cluster window, keep their deposit at the current level, but if there are more, then the deposit will increase.
Sandra, I would suggest that you put that in your comments.
Okay.
I do not see any further callers in the queue as of now.
Okay, well, let's move to the next slide then. So for this item, should site exclusivity be required rather than deposit for site exclusivity to progress into the phase 2 study process? And for this, the ISO proposal is that site exclusivity will be required to move into the phase 2 study process. And we propose this, that it would apply to cluster 14 and future clusters beyond cluster 14. This will help to mitigate the overheated queue and allow studies to focus on what we think will be more committed projects. And this proposal provides more flexibility than other ISO and RTOs in the timing for obtaining a final site. There's some information in the paper related to that, and most ISOs and RTOs across the U.S. require site exclusivity for phase 1. So this is still more flexible and lenient than other ISOs and RTOs. So are there any questions related to this?
I do not see any callers in the queue as of now.
All right, let's move on then. So this is the list of items to be removed from the initiative scope based on lack of stakeholder support, similar to the slide that Danielle had. But these are more in this category for dealing with the overheated queue. So there are 3 items. One is, would different requirements for different technologies to advance in the interconnection process be appropriate, such as location-specific resources versus more location-flexible resources? And we did not receive any consistent and enough stakeholder support to consider moving this one forward, so it will not. Second item is, should equipment requirements be introduced, such as status of equipment procured or something to that effect at some point in the process? And we did not see enough stakeholder support for this item as well. And the last item is, should interconnection application requirements differ for resources that are location constrained versus resources like standalone batteries that can be located pretty much anywhere on the grid, just looking for the best location to interconnect? And again, this one did not receive enough support for it to be moving forward. So these 3 items will not be included in the next process. Any question on these?
As a reminder, you may enter the question queue by using the WebEx raise hand icon located just above the chat panel. You'll hear a beep tone when your line is unmuted. At that time, please state your name and question. If you're just on the phone line and not using the WebEx audio, please dial #2 on your phone to enter the question queue. You'll hear a notification when your line is unmuted. At that time, please state your name and question.
Okay, why don't we move forward?
I do not see any callers. I'm sorry, go ahead, please.
Yeah, why don't we go ahead and move to the next slide? So the next group of issues are what we're calling other residual issues that we saw related to the process that we were planning to bring into an IPE process similar or prior to the cluster 14 issues that we experienced. So these have been something we've been thinking about for a period of time. So let's move to the next slide, please. So this one is, should the ISO reconsider an alternative cost allocation treatment for network upgrades to local systems, less than 200 kV systems, where the associated generation benefits the interconnection project or other systems more than the customers within the service area of the PTO owning the facilities? So the ISO for this is proposing to cap the percentage of the interconnection-related network upgrade costs within each PTO's local transmission revenue requirement. We'll be using a cost limiting model similar to the one used for funding local constrained resource interconnection facilities, also known as LCRF. Any cost for low voltage network upgrades greater than a 15% threshold will be financed by the interconnection customer without cash reimbursement. So in this case, there will be a limit based on each of the PTO system or what that 15% threshold would be. And if a project finds that it is hitting that, they always have the opportunity to move forward in that particular point of interconnection or move possibly to the higher voltage system. This will protect local ratepayers from rate shock associated with impact of interconnection-related network upgrades. And the proposal will apply to all transmission owners equally, avoiding cost shifting among ratepayers that would result from shifting costs from the local system to the regional TAC. And this item is going to be associated with the phase 2 timeline. So with that, are there any questions?
I do see one caller in the queue. Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Yeah, hi, Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. It seems like this obviously is there to address the VEA issue, and I know you guys tried to do that before, and did not get approval for it. But it seems like given the size of the rate base for the rest of the revenue requirements for the rest of the PTOs, or certainly large PTOs, really you're just going to, it seems like it would just keep people out of this area. But I guess I have a more practical question. So is the CAISO going to publicize for each of the PTOs what this threshold amount would be? That's my first question.
Yes, there's actually a document that's on the ISO website that shows the amount of current investment in the rates for high voltage and low voltage systems for each of the PTOs. And so, yeah, I think that would be an appropriate thing to do to kind of be able to link that document within the interconnection area, as well as to show a tracking of where we stand currently within related to that 15% threshold.
Okay, then, but the interconnection customer doesn't know until they get their studies what their costs actually are. So they wouldn't know for their cluster or for their project, they wouldn't know if they were going to exceed this threshold, right?
To some extent, that's true, based on what maybe upfront studies the customer may be doing. Okay,
and so so let's say a cluster would exceed this 15% threshold. Do all of them each have to? Are they each subject to the same percentage non-reimbursement, or how would you do that exactly?
At this point, I don't think we have a proposal that would firm up that particular issue. Typically, what we've seen in the past is, at least with the VEA, it's not a whole cluster group of projects seeking to interconnect that are having similar upgrade requirements that they're sharing, but that would be something that is more of a likelihood at the PTO level, related to the larger PTOs. So that's something we would need to develop some more specific criteria for. So any ideas you would have on that, we'd love to see that in your comments.
Okay. Well, I mean, it seems like the proposal the CAISO had out there before was based on the belief that if the reason that the CAISO had proposed, as I recall, to take a portion or to take the amount above a certain threshold and not impose it on the interconnection customers, but to spread that among all of the PTOs with the idea that the load-serving entities in any area could be among the customers of those particular projects, and that therefore it was not cost shifting to have them take some of that burden, because the whole idea of everybody takes their own is there's projects in different places and everybody can contract anywhere they want. But the CAISO had made the argument, at least, that because others these projects would be there to serve load-serving entities in other areas, that it was actually fair. It wasn't cost shifting. It was actually could be cost shifting to leave the cost there, but it wasn't cost shifting to shift them to other PTO areas. So does the CAISO now not believe that anymore?
Well, I might leave it up to Bill to answer further, but FERC obviously did not agree with that approach.
I think that's accurate, Bob.
Okay, so the only place to put it then really is on the interconnection customer, and that's what you're proposing to do here.
Right. We were thinking that the LCRIF model is something that would be appropriate to propose in this case as well.
How would the LCRIF model apply to this situation?
Well, it kind of provides kind of the framework for this. So we utilize that in helping us to develop the proposal and the threshold.
Well, the LCRIF model it seemed like that was completely different. That was where if you had you had certain commitments for capacity on an interconnection, trunk line interconnection, which those exact projects would have the right to use, then there would be some sort of temporary bridge kind of financing to make sure that those trunk lines got built so that others could use them. But the projects committing actually had the right to priority use of what they had signed up for, as you would on a Gentie line. So I'm not really seeing how does this relate to that kind of a concept?
Well, just bringing in a few of the components of those items. I have to admit, Steve Ruddy is the one that put this proposal together, and he wasn't able to make it. How are you? Go ahead,
Bob. I'm on the call. Yeah.
Hey, Steve.
Hey, Susan, the 15% level that we came up for this is the same as the amount that's used for the LCRIF. If the amount that a PTO would have to pay is over 15% of their net investments in high voltage systems, they don't have to pay anymore. They're not going to have to invest in an LCRIF. So that's where we came up with a 15% level for low voltage, where a PTO wouldn't have to pay over a certain threshold. So you need to go back and look at the LCRIF language about how the 15% is imposed, and that's how we came up with it for this proposal.
Okay, all right, that's helpful. Thank you. I have one more question. If you say that they could simply that the projects had simply moved to the higher voltage system, would the CAISO, let's say after a phase 1 study, the cost estimate comes out and you see, oh, you're going above the threshold, would the projects there have the ability to at that point to change their POI to the high voltage system? Would they be allowed that flexibility?
Well, that's something you could put in your comments. We hadn't really thought for that. We're hoping that they'd go to the high voltage immediately once they know. And remember, this 15% threshold, once the 15% threshold is hit, it's not another 15% for the next cluster. It's hit. Nobody else after that point gets cost coverage. So the first couple in will get cost recovery, maybe, depending on what their low voltage upgrades are. And then once we hit that 15%, then there's no more to come,
Right. No, I understand.
Available.
But
okay.
But a project doesn't know if they're going to trigger network upgrades unless they have a study of some kind. I mean, maybe after the 2 clusters in a row trigger whatever, then you might know. But it may be that a project can connect with no network upgrade, and so because there is actually room. So anyway, I think that there'll be some transitional issues here. Yeah, you're right. After it's known that there's no more room, nobody will apply to connect to those things. But you could have some times in between where people just don't know until they get a study, and so I think that will be that those interim things will be maybe a little problematic. But anyway, thank you. I appreciate your discussing this with me here. Thanks.
Yeah, no. If you have an idea of how we can do a transition and it won't impact others, then yeah, no, we can work on that.
Okay, thanks.
This is Bill. I was just going to say, if they do switch their POI after phase 1, they wouldn't have protection in the cost cap from the phase 1 study. It would only be the phase 2 study that affects the cost cap. But
yeah, good point.
As Keith said, yeah, we'll clarify possible switches going forward.
And that is something we have dealt with in the past.
I'm sorry, go ahead, please.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, moving on to the next caller in the queue. Please go ahead, your line is unmuted.
Hi, Songzhe Zhu from Greenbrier. First, I want to comment that moving to high voltage POI doesn't always solve the problem. 230 kV interconnection could still cause problem on the 138 kV. Then also, I want to get some clarification. So for the generation interconnection, there's a cap for here 15%. But if a project is approved, a transmission upgrade is approved through the TPP, meanwhile, well, then this will be removed from this limitation will be removed from the GIP. Is that right?
Yeah, for like an ADNU?
Yeah, for all LDNU.
I mean, you're right that if it becomes a TPP project, then it's not allocated to interconnection customers, yes.
Yeah, so then they won't be subject to this at all.
Right.
Yeah.
And Sanjay, you're right that a mitigation still may be needed after moving to the high voltage system, but at that point, there would be 100% cost recovery based on basic criteria that we have outside of this.
Okay, thanks for that clarification.
I do not see any further callers in the queue as of now.
Okay, well, let's move to the next slide. Thank you. So this is for a policy for the ISO as an expected system. How is the base case determined, and how are the required upgrades paid for? So for this, the ISO is proposing that the base case assumptions for the study to be based on previously queued projects as of the time that the affected system study agreement is executed. And we will use the existing policy for RNU reimbursement for RNUs that result from an affected system study. So we are proposing that we would reimburse projects interconnecting outside the ISO but have RNU upgrades on the ISO system, that they would be reimbursed like projects that are interconnecting within the ISO. Under FERC Order 2003, the ISO must provide some form of remuneration for the project financing of network upgrades, either in the form of cash reimbursement or transmission rights. So we feel that this is an appropriate way of dealing with this particular issue, and with a small number of requests for studies where the ISO is an affected system, the ISO believes that this is the best course forward. And this item will be going forward in phase 2 as a phase 2 item. So are there any questions for this?
I do not see any callers in the queue as of now.
Okay, well, let's move to the next slide, please. So this slide is for expanded error and omission process to provide criteria and options where changes to the network upgrade requirements occur after financial security postings have been made. And there were originally in the original scoping paper 2 separate components that really do lend themselves to bring them in together. So this paper combines 2 items from the preliminary issue paper, where the first was the process for changes to network upgrade requirements after the second IFS posting, and the second item was withdrawal options for projects impacted by new costs and or delay in in-service dates after the initial posting. And the ISO is proposing that any cost responsibility increase associated with the error or omission discovered after the project make its second interconnection financial security posting should be the responsibility of the party that made the error or omission. And when an error or omission is discovered after a project has made its first or second interconnection financial security posting, that increases the aggregate of all costs of the project to interconnect. The ISO is proposing that the project would be given the option to accept the changes and move forward, or withdraw and receive a full refund of its interconnection financial security posting and a refund of any unused study deposits. And along with this proposal we're proposing the cost increase thresholds for this would be at 5% and a minimum of 12-month delay in the earliest achievable COD. So there was kind of a similar item, but different that we have used in the supercluster process, where we had since we have less assurance on certain cost caps going from phase 1 to phase 2 related to cluster 14, we did provide an option for projects that have a cost increase of 25% or more going from phase 1 to phase 2 to be able to withdraw and get all their money back. But this is a bit different, where this is cost increase where we have all of the cost cap mechanisms in place, maximum cost responsibility, maximum cost exposure, and then we see costs go up above those levels. We felt that it shouldn't be as high a level to reach a threshold to be able to withdraw and get all of your posting back. So we are proposing that threshold would be 5%, and then we are using the same impact on the earliest achievable in-service date of 12 months. So are there any questions on this one?
I see one caller in the queue. Please go ahead, your line is unmuted.
Hi, Susan Scheider again. Just a clarification question. So the part where if the cost responsibility after the project makes a second IFS posting, the cost responsibility increases for an error and omission is the responsibility of the party that made the error and omission. So if the customer had not provided complete information or something, maybe that would be the customer's fault, or if there was an error the PTO had made, or the ISO. I guess the PTO, then it would be the PTO that would take the cost responsibility increase. But then you go down to the next proposal, then you go down to the next proposal, and then that says after the parties make its first or second posting, then if the aggregate of all costs for the project to increase go up, then the customer, if they stay in, would have to accept that cost increase. But that seems contrary to the one above that says if there's an error, then let's just say it was a PTO error of, let's call it 10% on the first one, where after the second posting, and then the third bullet here then says if there's a 10% error, then the customer could have the option to accept it and move forward. But the second bullet says that the PTO would take the increase. I'm just trying to make sure I understand what you're proposing here.
So in the case of typically what we've seen for the first component is where we've seen an error omission come up much later in the process, where people have made their second posting and do a reassessment or something else, something has come up and it's very late in the process. And so I think these things, it allows the customer to either withdraw, or in that case, the PTO may accept it. But the bigger issue in those instances was typically not the cost, because
but the schedule
PTO was already paying, was the schedule.
Yeah.
So in that case, the customer had the opportunity to be able to withdraw or will have the opportunity to withdraw and get its money back, regardless of who pays that cost.
Okay, so let's say the issue is the cost. It seems like the second bullet here says that in this situation, the PTO would have to absorb the cost, but then the third bullet says if the customer wants to continue, they would have to absorb the cost. I just was trying to understand is there a difference there, or is there a conflict there, or what? I'm just, it's not clear.
Yeah, I think in this case, we'll have to provide some more clarification, but at least they would have the opportunity if the cost does go up by more than 5%, regardless who actually covers those costs, they can actually get their money back and get out of the process. So we still have the process of who covers the cost, but now we're adding that additional component that if it goes up enough to hit the 5% threshold, they can actually get out, regardless of who would have covered the cost if they stayed in.
Okay, and that does make sense. That's why I was trying to go with that. That does make sense, because when the project is bidding, say, for a PPA under least cost best fit, their transmission costs, even if it's capped or if they don't have to pay it, their transmission costs, I think, is sort of counted against them in that process. So if it would turn out to be, let's say it was a really large error, their project may not be competitive, even if they were to get reimbursement or didn't have to cover that cost, because their project isn't viable anymore. So I mean, I think this makes sense together. I just trying to get clarification for that.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Are there any other questions?
Yes, I do see another caller in the queue. Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hi, Songzhe Zhu from Greenbright. So in the proposal, it also says the MCR and MCE cannot be increased due to error in omission after the second IF posting. So how does that work with this responsibility is the IC? So if it is IC's responsibility, but then MCR, MCE cannot be increased, how do they take on that additional cost?
Well, let me give you an example of what we have seen in the past, which was discussed just a bit ago, where, for example, interconnection customer wants to connect to a particular point of interconnection. They find an issue that the cost is greater to interconnect to that point than they expected, and they request to move into phase 2, that they move to a different point of interconnection. And in those cases, we have actually said we will allow this if you waive your maximum cost responsibility for the cost cap between phase 1 and phase 2. So we have ways that we have dealt with those kind of issues.
Okay, so the MCR, MCE can be increased, actually doesn't include this situation. If it's IC's responsibility, then they have to give up on that.
Right. Where for the IC to make those kind of changes, they have to say, well, in order for the ISO to agree to it, you have to agree to waive your cost cap.
Okay, thank you.
I do not see any further callers in the queue as of now.
Okay, let's move to the next slide. Thank you. So this item is to clarify the definition of a reliability network upgrade, where the ISO is proposing to clarify the existing policy that a RAS is always considered a reliability network upgrade, regardless of the study that identified the need for the RNU. And all RNUs will continue to be included in the RNU cost calculation for RNU costs that are eligible for cash reimbursements. And one of the questions that stakeholders had was related to a RAS may be required for a project to synchronize to the grid. And there's really no way around that. A limited operation study is needed to determine if the project can synchronize to prior to the RAS being in service or not. So there may be cases where they can, but it would take a limited operation study to make that determination. And this is a phase 1 item as well. So are there questions for this?
I do see one caller in the queue. Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hi, Susan Schneider. Just a clarifying question, and I apologize if this is a stupid non-engineer question, but it seems like if a RAS is triggered by a DNU, that it shouldn't be required to synchronize. And you do actually distinguish between the DNU, I forgot what it's called, DNU related RNU or something like that, DNU triggered RNU. And so if it's triggered by the DNU, then why would it be needed for interconnection?
Well, I guess I would categorize it a bit differently than that, which is it was determined to be needed in a deliverability study. It's not necessarily triggered by a DNU per se. So within the deliverability study, it was determined that this reliability network upgrade is needed. And even if, and if a RAS is determined to be needed for a cluster group, even an energy-only RAS, or excuse me, an energy-only project would need that particular RAS, and they would need to have that limited operation study as well to determine if it's needed for them to go online.
Well, an energy-only project wouldn't have any DNU-triggered RNUs, would they? Because they're not even in the deliverability assessments.
But if a RAS is needed for a project within a study group, it's going to be needed typically for all the projects, including the energy-only projects. So, I mean, I'm basically stating that example as to drive home that it truly is a reliability network upgrade, even though it's triggered within the deliverability study.
So energy.
Could I interject? I mean, because I think we described this very precisely in the paper, and I think the word triggering is not like I think it's identified in the deliverability study, and if we did, the reliability study second, as it were, based on those assumptions, then it would be identified there, but it is for all senses reliability. But I think we're just kidding. I think I would just refer everyone to the paper on this and then solicit comments.
Oh, okay. Well, we did look at it, but we'll put it in our comments. Thanks.
All right. Any other questions on this?
I do not see any further callers in the queue as of now.
Okay, let's move to the next slide, please. Okay, so this item is for transferring projects from the PTO, Wholesale Distribution Access Tariff Process, to transfer a WDAP project into the ISO queue, where initially the interconnection request came to the PTO in their WDAP process, but it turned out that their project was actually interconnecting to a point on the ISO control grid. So the ISO is proposing to develop tariff language for accepting the interconnection request transfers from the PTO WDAP queue into the ISO queue. And for a more detailed proposal, we will work with the PTOs to develop specific criteria necessary to ensure that the transfer occurs within an appropriate window of time. Each PTO has different windows for their WDAP processes, and we want to just make sure that what we end up proposing for more specific criteria related to this really makes sense, and we don't have certain windows still open while our window is closed and so forth. We just want to make sure it makes sense what we propose here. So we'll have to work with the PTOs, and the PTOs could, and we're hoping that they do, revise their WDAP to include a reciprocal language about receiving IRs initially submitted to the ISO, that where the ISO finds that later on, that after the window closes for them, for the PTOs, that it's actually an interconnection to their distribution system. So are there any questions related to this? Okay, it's a pretty straightforward one. So why don't we move to the next topic? And this item we've seen kind of brewing, but really came to a head pretty strongly within Cluster 14, where changing sites in POIs during the IR validation as we're seeing more and more requests to make changes. So the ISO proposes the timing of the process for changing POIs remains consistent with the current ISO practice, where, excuse me, the interconnection customer must confirm its POI within 5 business days of the project scoping meeting, and any change in the POI will be limited to within the same transmission study area as the POI originally requested in their interconnection request. And project site changes will only be permitted in conjunction with a permissible change in the POI. Any questions related to this?
Yes, I do see a couple of callers in the queue. Moving on to the first caller. Please go ahead, your line is unmuted.
Songje Zhu from Great Bright. First, I want to clarify. So you mean the POI change will be within the same transmission study area as defined in the TPP?
No, as defined within the interconnection request process.
Okay, so it's based on the GIP study area, not the TPP local study area.
Yes.
Okay, that's my question. Thank you.
Moving on to the next caller. Please go ahead, your line is unmuted.
Yes, it's going to sound like a broken record. This is Susan Schneider, and I wanted to follow up on Sanjay's question. When you say the study, the PTO or the study area, that's the cluster study area that you're talking about, or the PTO area, or what do you mean the cluster study area?
Yes, the cluster study area that the project would be in based on its original POI.
Okay, and then just one more clarification on the last bullet here. You know, project sites can be adjusted. There's sometimes lease activity and other things that happened that don't involve the change in POI. This wouldn't be limited. It'd still be the same rules for that kind of thing, wouldn't it?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
I do not see any further callers in the queue as of now.
All right, well, let's move on to the next slide. And at this point, I'll turn it over to, I'm not sure if it's Jason or Debbie taking this on.
Actually, this is Deb. I can do it. So one of the items that was in the paper was to question and asking for stakeholder input on whether the CAISO should be more aggressive on the 7 years that a project is sitting in the queue. And should we be more aggressive as far as ensuring that the project is moving forward? And should we be able to terminate the GIA earlier than the 7-year period if they aren't replying to queries and information requests, things like that? We didn't really get any comments back from anyone on this other than a few said this would be interesting to explore. So what I ended up doing on this is posing some questions. You know, should projects that are energy only be allowed to stay in the queue forever? That's the way it currently, the rules are in the tariff. If you're energy only, there's no commercial viability criteria anymore for you, so you can continue to push out your COD for forever. We have in the generator interconnection agreement, both the large LGIA and SGIA, the ability to get information from projects as to the status of the project. If a project doesn't reply to that, should there be a time limit by which we say, okay, you're not replying, we're going to go ahead and put you in breach of the contract because you're not replying to our inquiries as to the status of the contract. Same thing, we have a number of projects. Anybody can look at the queue report, public queue report, and see that there are a whole bunch of projects that have COD dates that have already passed. And part of the challenge that we have is that we keep pinging the project and asking them to put in a material modification request to change their COD to something that is workable. And in some instances, we get, yeah, we'll put something in next week, or we'll put something in next month, and next week and next month come, and it's still, they don't reply. And in some instances, we send requests and we get nothing back. So it just sits out there, and we need to wait for a milestone in the contract to come up in order for us to move the project into breach of the GIA. In a number of instances, the way the contracts are written, the notice to proceed has to come from the customer, and until the notice to proceed comes from the customer, there's nothing we can do as far as the milestones are concerned. So should we allow that to just stay out there and allow projects to sit until they actually reach the 7 years, and then in essence they're in over the 7 years and would be in default of the contract? And another option is if the project is not moving with the permitting, procurement, construction, other than specific milestones that are in the contract, should we do something about that? So in this instance, what we're looking for is feedback from the, interconnection customers and PTOs. Is there something further that we should be doing to get projects either moving or out of the queue in advance of the 7 years? So any questions with that?
I do see a caller in the queue. Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Yeah, hi Debbie, Susan Schneider. Yeah, these are all good questions, and what you're inferring here seems very reasonable. I don't think anybody wants a bunch of dead projects to be sitting around taking up space, even if they're not, even if they're energy only. So they're really good questions, and I think some of it will bear some definition, like when does a project need an MMA? Yeah, obviously after the CODs pass, but that seems like then they violated the GIA. So maybe the CAISO has more enforcement ability here that it's taking, but we'll be sure and comment on this, but these all seem like very reasonable questions.
Thank you.
I do not see any further callers in the queue as of now.
All right, next slide, please. So this is another question that we have. So should park projects be allowed to submit MMAs while they're parked? And the reason why we're asking this question is that it takes staff work by the planners, the engineers, and project management staff to go ahead and process material modification assessments for projects when they are in the queue. And a park project is just sitting there. They didn't accept the TPD allocation, or they accepted less than it's not enough for the project to move forward. They're not in the generator interconnection agreement negotiation process. They are just sitting there, and they can sit there for up to 2 years. So the question is should we allow a park project to submit an MMA, or should they go ahead and submit the MMA once they come out of parking because they are moving forward? And that would be a good time to then reset what the requirements are, so going into the negotiation, all of the issues could be resolved. So with that, any questions?
I do see a caller in the queue. Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Yeah, hi, Susan Schneider again. First of all, these guys can't negotiate GIAs because they're not actually allowed to, even if they want to request one. That was a change that was made a while ago. But I think that the main issue here is sometimes it's maybe not be that they didn't accept the TPD allocation. Maybe they didn't even qualify for one because they weren't shortlisted, or maybe they might have bid into maybe several solicitations and weren't shortlisted. They don't have a PPA. But there may be some changes as a result of the feedback they got from that process, where if they need to change their project in some way so that they can acquire a PPA or can acquire, at least get shortlisted and be more successful, but they can't make any of those changes if they're just sitting in the parking. And if you don't allow them to change the project while they're parked, then when they come out of parking, they won't qualify. They wouldn't have a chance to necessarily qualify for an allocation the next time around. So they can use that year productively, potentially, to change the project, bid it in again, maybe get shortlisted or whatever. But if they can't change the project, if there's something that kept them from doing it the first time, they can't be ready the second time if they can't even ask about it until they come out of parking, and then it's already time for the allocation. So I think there's a real timing question, and that time can be used productively to qualify the next time around if they're allowed to do it.
So to the extent that they are trying to make a modification in order to be a viable project for the next go-around for TPD allocation, could we just do those MMAs? We get willy-nilly MMAs.
I'm sure you do.
changes in inverters during a park project. Inverters aren't going to change whether the project is going to be picked up as a PPA or not. Changing a point of interconnection might be, but changing, inverters or transformers, stuff like that, that, in my mind, doesn't establish whether they're going to be viable to receive a power purchase agreement.
Well, changing their configuration.
So just some thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, maybe the middle ground is maybe better defining what kind of MMA request they could make, but changing their configuration, for example, so maybe they could be divided into different, smaller segments to qualify for more PPAs or something. I think so. Maybe there is some way to get through this, and I understand that not every change would really be aimed to that. So maybe there's a way to narrow it down a little bit that might be a good compromise here.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, thanks. We'll think about that.
This is Bob. I think I'd like to chime in that, another item here is that, we tend to think of parks projects as, well, they're sitting there not doing anything. But in reality, I understand that, that's the only place they can go if they didn't receive an allocation the first opportunity or they don't qualify. But another component of that is they don't have to post. And maybe I'd like to see people make comments on it that if they'd like to see an opportunity for a project, a wild park to submit an MMA, would they be required to make a second posting in order to do that MMA, to qualify for an MMA? I think that might be something that might be justified. I'd like to hear stakeholder input on that.
Okay, well, we'll think about that. Thanks.
I do not see any callers in the queue as of now.
All right, next slide.
Thanks, Debbie. I think actually is a good time now to break. I think we're going to be able to give a full hour for lunch for folks. So thank you again, Susan and Sanjay and others for the questions. As Danielle mentioned, this is intended to open up discussion, and this is first meeting of the stakeholder process on this topic in a few years, I think. So thanks for the questions, and we'll look to continue this at 1 p.m. Pacific. Let me know if you have any questions until then. Thanks, everyone.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Hopefully everybody had a good lunch, and we're going to get back into this. So we are here at slide 27, which is the beginning of other stakeholder suggested proposals. And why don't we move to slide 28? So these are the items that Southern California Edison brought up in their presentation and in their comments. The presentation we did at the last stakeholder discussion phase of this process. So their first item was to re-examine and remove ambiguity of errors and omissions in the study reports before the initial and second IFS posting has been made. And the ISO already had this item in our list of items, and we are proposing to address Edison's asking for additional clarity within our expanded error and omissions issue. It is described on slide 21 in this presentation and in the other issues section of the paper. Item number 2 is adding due date for curing deficiencies to Appendix B to avoid delays in starting the phase 2 studies. And the ISO is proposing to add a deadline for validation of Appendix Bs. It's a difficult one to actually come up with a solid deadline because the validation of Appendix Bs can take a bit of time. You want to make sure that everybody has adequate time, including the project that had the very last scheduled results meetings for either their phase 1 study. So what we were proposing is that all Appendix Bs would be required to be validated by 70 calendar days after the date of the phase 1 study report. And this will be added to the phase 1 process of this initiative. Item number 3 is seeking to have IR validation process and deemed complete prior to the holding scoping meetings. This is an item that we changed in IPE 2018, where as we have gotten into larger and larger clusters, it's been more and more difficult to get everybody validated prior to getting into the scoping meetings. And with the models and different technologies that we've got, it's been more difficult to get everybody over the finish line with all of their required models. So we made this change in IPE 2018, and the ISO doesn't agree that this process needs to be changed at this time. We'd like to see this process play out a little bit more, where we actually get some data of how well it works, when we have more of a reasonable cluster size. This proposal would be going back to the validation timeline prior to cluster 12, and we'd like to see it play out a little bit more. So we are not agreeing with this, and we do not plan to include this in the process. Although maybe in the future, it might be time to reconsider that. Item number 4 is make it explicit that when ICs agree to share a GenTie, a PTO interconnection facility, and any related IR news at the substation across clusters, then the shared IRNUs are not subject to the GitApp section 14.2.2. This is the section where the PTO is required to backstop the cost of network upgrades that were assigned to any project that executed the GIA and then withdrew. So Edison, as well as I think San Diego was interested in this one as well, that we do not use that same criteria under these particular circumstances. So the ISO is seeking further stakeholder input on this and be part of the phase 1 process. So we're looking to get stakeholders to weigh in on this proposal by Edison, and that we can develop a proposal based on all the feedback for the next paper. Are there any questions on this slide?
Yes, I do see a caller in the queue. Please go ahead, your line is unmuted.
Yeah, hi, Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. Just a really quick question about the item number 2 here. It seems like, so when you're going with 70 days, does that mean like, is that sort of like the 60-day timeline for the scope, for the results meetings plus 10 days? Is that kind of where you got the 70 days?
No, it was more from standpoint that after 90 days is when the posting is due. So we wanted to give a significant amount of time, and we felt that, okay, once you hit day 70, if the Appendix B has not been validated, then we'd be withdrawing the project, but that would give them 5 business days to cure. So through that whole process, it starts to get close enough to the 90 days that we thought that's about as far out as we felt comfortable in allowing that validation process to go.
Well, I guess my question is, if you're sort of the tail end of the scoping meetings, you could be close to, are you guys going to, even for cluster 14, are you going for all the scoping meetings within 60 days?
We actually, for cluster 14, have more time for that. I'd have to go back and look at our tariff changes to know exactly how much time, but so this wouldn't necessarily apply for cluster 14 related to the 70 days. So
okay. So if you are, let's just say you're doing all of them in 60 days, and the people at the tail end would have to submit Appendix B. You would have to get back to them with any deficiency notices, and then they would have to cure the deficiencies, and it would be a really tight, seems like it would be a really tight timeline for those last projects in the results meetings.
Well, we're already dealing with that now. I think we've dealt with that somewhat, and we get to a point where we can only delay it so long. I don't, feel free to provide an alternative proposal, but we can't have it go beyond the due dates for the initial postings.
Well, I actually, it seems like, well, I have two I think observations about that. One of them is that they could go ahead and make their posting even if they hadn't, there would obviously be a risk to that if they haven't cured deficiencies by then. So they're not necessarily related, although I agree it would be weird. But what's the deadline? The not wanting to delay phase 2 studies makes sense. How long can you go without delaying phase 2 studies?
So typically we're waiting for the postings to be made, and once the postings are all cleared is when they start the base case for phase 2. So it would potentially be delaying it to go beyond the posting timeframe.
Okay, so you've got some time between day 70 and day 90, and so that you're looking for some input to, kind of whether it should go long, in that period. Is that? Well,
just so you know, my team suggested 60 days, and I pushed it to 70. I don't know if we have a whole lot more time beyond that, but feel free to suggest what you think is appropriate from your end.
Okay, great, thank you.
I do not see any further callers in the queue as of now.
All right, well, thank you. And Jason, I think you have the next slide.
Thank you, Bob. I do. So on behalf of Deb Levine, who had to step away for another meeting, I'll go through the next few slides here. Gridwell did propose the idea that, and the concept of improving data transparency for stakeholders, that it's provided in more of a usable format, really. The ISO, upon further review, does agree that we could be providing some additional data in maybe some different formats. And we're proposing to work with stakeholders in the phase 1 near-term enhancements to determine what data can become public, more accessible and usable for those stakeholders. I'll pause here for any questions. All right, hearing none, I think we can go to the next slide. All right, LSA SIA had, I believe, 11 items here to review. I'll cover the first 5. Bob is going to jump in for 6 through 9, and then I'll cover item 10 and 11. The first item here is the delays caused by participating transmission owners. The question here is, the requirement for commercial viability criteria and, essentially not harming interconnection customers due to a COD or milestone extension required by the PTOs. Here, we do agree that the IC should not be harmed in this case. We are taking this forward and allowing this to be a topic which we'll rename to modification to commercial viability criteria and be addressing this in the near-term enhancements. Item 2 is better differentiation within the clusters. This topic really requires additional feedback. We're proposing to address this in the scope for transmission grid data transparency that I just mentioned from Gridwell here in the near-term enhancements. The interim deliverability status transparency, the ISO cannot determine as part of the phase 2 study process the determination of which projects would be allotted or even which study areas would be allotted interim deliverability status or where deliverability would be available at that time. We're proposing to not include this in the scope for 2021. And then item 4, the network upgrade restack. Really, we're seeking further stakeholder input here in the near-term enhancements. And if I understand correctly, there's a little bit more on this in the straw proposal paper. I'll pause here before we move on to the next slide and see if there are any questions or clarifications. All right, hearing none, I think we can keep going. Expanding the deliverability transfer opportunities here, I believe the idea is to allow transfers of deliverability to be at the same voltage level at a substation rather than the same bay position or utilizing the same gen-tie line that currently the requirement is today. We do agree to revise and bring this to allow projects to transfer deliverability at the same substation level and the same voltage level, and we'll be addressing this in the near-term enhancements. I'm going to pause here real quick. Bob was going to cover 6 through 9, but I see Susan raised her hand, so I'm assuming it's relative to topic 5 here. Can we take Susan's question really quick?
Looks like she lowered her hand.
Okay. So, yeah, Bob, do you want to go through 6 through 9, and then we can pause there for questions again?
So kind of combining items 6, 7, and 8 together, these are all related to the transmission plan deliverability allocation and retention process, which we revised pretty significantly, and I think we agreed with and accepted most of these items that were proposed here. Related to the process for retention, we did simplify that. However, we are still, the one retention item we did retain is that if you are in group 2, even the current in the new group 2, where you receive an allocation by means of being shortlisted or actively negotiating a PPA, we are still going to require that the PPA be executed by November 30th of the year that you received the allocation from. But related to kind of bumping up the priority for energy-only projects, where if you were before we had energy-only projects, the best you could be is group 4. Now, even if you had a PPA, so we've combined all those for anybody that has a PPA, regardless of your deliverability status, you are in group 1. If you are shortlisted, regardless of your deliverability status at the time, you can be in group 2 for the shortlisted, and then group 3 is now any project that comes online but doesn't qualify for groups 1 and 2 can receive an allocation. So we pretty much accepted those particular proposals. For option B, the ISO didn't necessarily intend for option B to be something that would be used fairly frequently. It was something that we felt in open access that we needed to do, that provide a means for a project to build area deliverability network upgrades, even if there were none available at that time. But we don't agree that this item actually should be reformed. In particular, we don't agree that it should be reformed if there is any reform needed within the GitApp process, that it really belongs in the transmission planning process, and that's the best arena to be considering adding any new deliverability network upgrades to the system. We feel that if further discussions want to be held related to this option, that it really should be done within the scope of, it should not be done within the scope of IPE, but it should be done within the scope of the transmission planning process. So with that, I'll open it up for questions.
As a reminder, if you're connected to the computer audio or use the Call Me feature in WebEx, you may enter the question queue by using the WebEx raise hand icon located just above the chat panel. You'll hear a beep tone when your line is unmuted. At that time, please state your name and question. If you're just on the phone line and not using the WebEx audio, please dial #2 on your phone to enter the question queue. You'll hear a notification when your line is unmuted. At that time, please state your name and question. I do see a caller in the queue. Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hi, Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. Just a couple of things. Just on option B reform, I understand that option B was not supposed to be used. I think you put it not fairly frequently, but it really is. Has any upgrade ever been built under option B?
No.
Okay. Well, that's not only not fairly frequently. That's like not ever.
Not with it. Okay, but not, at least put it this way, not within the interconnection process.
Well,
there
which
may
is
have
what
been
option
some
B is,
suggested
right?
items. Yeah. Right. But there
Yeah.
are still options for suggesting and trying to get additional upgrades built within the TPP.
Sure. But there's a difference between not fairly frequently, and not ever. And it just, if it's not ever, that really just indicates that it's not viable. And if you have it, it seems like maybe some changes to make it viable, if it's intended to be there for a reason, might be indicated. But we'll probably put that in our comments. Also, the reassessment accommodation. This was driven by some recent situations. Although I understand they have happened sometimes before, but some fairly significant situations where projects, got literally almost right before they were going to sign a GIA or a PPA, got significant changes in their project parameters, in their costs, or in particular in their timing, where all of a sudden their COD is going to come in 3 years later. And it just seems like the reassessment comes out, and the reassessments were much later than usual. So it was really, really close to when the TPD retentions or acquisition allocations or affidavits were due. And it seems like when there's that kind of crush where it's a late study and it's a very significant thing, there's not time for a project to correct in this case. And so that was the nature of the reassessment accommodation item. So I think we'll put it in our comments, but it just seems unreasonable when a study comes out a month or two before an affidavit where someone's on the verge of doing something, and there's that kind of significant change where there's no accommodation whatsoever in particular in the retention process. So anyway, I think we'll put it in our comments, but we were really a little disappointed. We were very grateful for the things you did include that we had here, but we're a little disappointed about that one in particular.
Okay, well, let me just respond to that, Susan. We really hope that and anticipate that we won't see those kind of events frequently in the future, to where, related to the supercluster, that the reassessment reports came out late. So that's something that they have come out a bit late before, but not like they did in 2021. So that's
right.
A bit of an anomaly, and hopefully that's not something that happens frequently. And, so consequently, it's not something that I think it's appropriate for us to build into the tariff for those type of things. So, and another point to that is that it's hard to carve out a specific criteria that under these circumstances we will allow that without people trying to then utilize that criteria for all sorts of other reasons for delaying the process for their particular purposes and impacts and so forth. So that's kind of where we're coming from.
Okay, well, it seems like you could use some of the things you were doing for the errors and omissions and say, well, if it's more than this amount or it's more than this timeline or something, perhaps that could be accommodated for something like this. Anyway, we'll put, as I say, we'll put it in our comments because there were some people that got their, the reassessment reports in September. It just wasn't enough time to do anything before the beginning of December. So, and one literally was, at least one that I know of, and this is just obviously anecdotal, but literally on the verge of signing a PPA and then realized they couldn't meet their COD. So anyway, it seems that we'll try and be a little creative and think about maybe some compromise things that could be narrow and maybe put that in our comments for your consideration if that's okay.
Sure.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, I do not see any further callers in the queue as of now.
All right, great. We can go on to slide 32 then. Thank you. And the last two items for LSA and SIA, the first, number 10, being battery augmentation. I believe the proposal here was to allow the changing of batteries over time without utilizing the MMA or the post-COD modification processes. And the ISO's response here is such that we can't jeopardize reliability on the grid with such a blanket approval of changing equipment out. There's times where changing, I'll say a technology manufacturer from one to another can change the technical characteristics of the plant, maybe not significantly, but enough that it would need to, at a minimum, be reviewed. And the ISO just can't allow such a blanket type of modification without it being reviewed. So this proposal would not be included in the 2021 IPE. And then the last item, affected system study options. If I understand this one correctly, the proposal was to have the California ISO complete the affected system studies on behalf of those affected systems. And, our response really is those specific affected systems that are identified, know their own reliability, electrical characteristics, protection settings, et cetera, on their own systems. And we would expect them to identify the reliability within their own system through that affected system study. Simply said, I guess the ISO doesn't have the technical capability of determining the reliability requirements on those affected systems, and therefore the proposal would not be included in 2021 IPE. I'll pause there for any questions. All right, I think we're good. I believe I'm handing it off to Danielle.
Yes, thanks, Jason, and thanks, Bob, for going through those. Go ahead and move to the next slide. Great, thank you. So the next 4 slides are outlining additional issues that stakeholders suggested to be included in the scope of the initiative. So we heard from quite a few stakeholders. CISA requested that the ISO should consider reporting on transmission upgrade project status, and they suggested this because it would help alleviate a key barrier to near and midterm resource deployments, and build out is timely constructed and the completion of network upgrades by PTOs. So having this information would be valuable for them. And as such, we are proposing to include this issue within the scope of the initiative, and we plan to address it within the scope of the transmission grid data transparency topic originally proposed by Gridwell. And this will be addressed in phase 1. Next, we heard from CalWIA. They had 3 specific items that they wanted to include in the scope of the initiative. The first was they recommended that CAISO consider streamlining the limited operational study process to allow generators to interconnect until the triggered GRNUs are actually needed and have policy on treating generators after the actual needs arise. And we agree that this is an issue that we should consider, so we're proposing to include it within the scope of the initiative and address it within the scope of the modification to commercial viability criteria topic, which was originally proposed by LSA-CIA. This will likewise be addressed in phase 1 of the initiative too. The second item CalWIA proposed was that when a generator seeks interconnection to an old substation, the PTO may require the substation to be converted in accordance with current design standards. And in such a situation, the PTO should not assign the full converting cost to the generator. The generator should only be assigned the cost for the facilities it uses to interconnect. And our response to this is that while we do support ongoing conversations on this issue, this process is not under the ISO's control. This is really a PTO process. So because of that, we will not be including this item in the scope of the initiative going forward, but we do encourage that conversation to be happening. The last item CalWIA proposed is they recommended the ISP electrical independence test be re-examined and also recommended a flow impact consideration for a project with impacts be done. And in response to this issue, we are seeking stakeholder input on a couple items. The first is we want to get a better understanding on why the existing tariff criteria outlined in Appendix CD, Section 4.2.1.1 is not just and reasonable. And further, we want to get more stakeholder input on specific proposals for revisions to the ISP electrical independence test criteria. And we're proposing that this item would be addressed under phase 2 long-term enhancements. So I'll go ahead and pause here before moving on to the next slide. See if there's any questions in the queue.
I do see a caller in the queue. Please go ahead, your line is unmuted.
Sonja Drew, Graybright. So regarding the ISP EIT electrical independence test, so the current tariff requires distribution factor greater than 5%, all flow impact greater than 5%. With the first one, the shift factor represents the electrical distance. Then the second one, the flow impact kind of include the size of the project. So instead of all, we are suggesting it should be an and. So it is close enough to the facility that requires upgrade in the cluster. Also, it has a significant or meaningful impact on that. So if the size is really small, although the distance is really close, the impact could be almost zero, especially for those small generators in the distribution system. So we just suggest change that all to and. Then, of course, if you change that to and, then you may lower the threshold for flow impact from 5% to maybe 2% or something.
Thank you for the comment, Sanjay. I would request that you include that in your written feedback to us, and we can add it to the next proposal.
Okay, we will.
Thank you. Are there any other questions in the queue?
I do not see any further callers in the queue as of now.
Okay, great. Let's go ahead and move to slide 34. Thank you. So moving on, the next batch of comments we received from stakeholders included one from PG&E. They identified a concern related to timely construction of shared network upgrades that have cross-cluster dependencies like the conditionally assigned network upgrades, as well as precursor network upgrades. And our response to this is that since the PTOs can require negotiation of the GIA timeline of the third posting, we're proposing to resolve this issue without further tariff changes. And as such, we will be removing this item from the scope of the initiative. Moving on, Rev Renewables suggested that the CAISO include an issue in the scope of the initiative that resolves the issue for when a developer issues a notice to proceed to the PTO. The PTO or ISO should start planning for all upgrades required for FCDS status, including upgrades triggered by a group of projects. And we agree that this is a concern and an issue that we should seek further stakeholder input on. So we're proposing to address this issue in phase 1 of the initiative and look forward to more stakeholder comments on this. The next issue listed on the slide was submitted by San Diego Gas and Electric. This was one of 5 issues that they requested be included in the scope of the initiative. So the first one is that they recommend the CAISO provide more guidance on how charging should be performed and include tariff language as to how upgrades can be assessed and allocated. At this time, we don't agree that specific study criteria guidance belongs in the tariff, and instead, charging studies should be worked into the cluster study plans developed by the ISO in coordination with the PTOs. And as such, we are proposing to not include this in the scope of this initiative going forward. So I'll pause here, see if there's any questions or comments. All right, hearing none, so let's go ahead and move to the next slide. Great. So the next item San Diego proposed was recommending the ISO include a requirement that interconnection customers obtain as approval as part of their interconnection request, and existing generators should be notified for future requests that impact their projects or gen-tie configurations. In response, we agree that this is an issue, and as such, we are proposing that any interconnection request that proposes to utilize a third-party owned gen-tie must provide documentation as part of their interconnection request. That would demonstrate that the gen-tie owner has agreed to the project proposed in the interconnection request using its gen-tie. This item will be addressed in phase 2, the long-term enhancements. The third item recommended by San Diego Gas and Electric was focused on developing a mechanism for IRNU reallocations with associated cost responsibility and cost exposure assigned to later queued projects. We're proposing to include this issue within the scope of the initiative and address it in conjunction with SCE's proposed issue, number 4, that Bob touched on, related to the GitApp section 14.2.2, and this item will be addressed in phase 1. And then the fourth item San Diego recommended was focused on RIMS document management. So they noted that during the interconnection request validation period, RIMS is heavily used for files to be shared between interconnection customers, the ISO, and PTOs. The system doesn't categorize, group, version, or organize the documents well. So San Diego suggested that after the IR validation, the ISO should be consistent in using RIMS for all documents, details, et cetera, related to the project. And in response to this, right now, the ISO doesn't upload MMA documents into RIMS, and RIMS doesn't have the capacity of accepting documents, Excel files, or other data. But we are seeking stakeholder input on adding functionality to go ahead and upload these MMA documents to RIMS, and this issue will be considered in scope for phase 1. Go ahead and move to the next slide, and then I'll pause for questions. So the final issue recommended by San Diego Gas and Electric is focused on requesting multiple items within the IR validation forms to be updated. And currently, the ISO does review and update the Appendix 1 interconnection request form and the Attachment A to the Appendix generating facility data spreadsheet prior to each cluster window. These items will be included in the review prior to the Cluster 15 application window. And so because of that, we will not be including this issue in the scope of this initiative. So let me pause here and see if there's any questions or comments related to, in particular, San Diego's issues that they would like to see in scope for the initiative. All right, hearing none. Okay, let's go ahead and move to the next slide. Thank you. So finally, I just wanted to take a moment to highlight for all the stakeholders on the call, all of the different issues and which specific phase of the IPE initiative they'll be addressed within. Since we've already gone through each of these issues in detail, I won't spend any time on this slide or any of the following 3 slides, but I just wanted to highlight that for clarification, this information has been provided for stakeholders so they can have a better understanding of what to expect in each phase going forward. So with that, I did see a question pop up in the chat. Maybe we can address that, and then I will pass it off to Jimmy to wrap up. So it looks like this question is from Ian Carney. Says he has a couple questions regarding the TPD allocation proposal. The paper and the slides differ on which phase this proposal falls under. Can the CAISO please clarify which initiative phase this proposal is a part of? Also, part of this proposal is to remove deliverability retention criteria for all groups, but Group 2. Can the CAISO clarify how this proposal impacts Tariff Appendix DD Section 8.9.2.2? I can answer the first question. So yes, it was a typo in the paper. The TPD allocation process revisions will be considered in scope for phase 1 of the initiative. So this slide on screen right now is accurate. So the presentation is accurate, and we will update the paper in the next iteration to reflect that change. Bob, maybe you can take the second part of this question.
Unfortunately, I don't know off the top of my head this particular tariff section that you're referring to. I can see if I can find it real quickly. Just to back up a bit, though, on the original question about the phase, this should be in phase 1 because we'd like to have this initiated in time to utilize this during the 2022-2023 allocation cycle. So it needs to be in phase 1 so we can get a FERC ruling in time to utilize it in next December affidavit timeframe. And go ahead.
Bob, this is Jason. Referring to 8.9.2.2, that is the Group 3 requirements associated with the, I would say, current Group 3 projects that have elected to proceed without a PPA. And I believe the response there is any projects that have elected and received an allocation in Group 3, today's current Group 3, would still be required to meet, and that section would still apply to those particular projects.
Right. In essence, we're not going to go backwards and remove people who've already chosen Group 3. Group 3 is open for allocation during this allocation cycle as well. So any project that have chosen that will continue to be able to proceed in as a Group 3 project. It would just, and under the same criteria that we have now, we're not anticipating changing any of this criteria. only just closing the door to group 3 starting next allocation cycle.
Ian, I hope that helps answer your questions. Please let us know if you have any other questions. And you know what, let me go ahead and see. Do we have any questions on the phone?
I do not see any callers in the queue as of now. As a reminder, if you're connected to the computer audio or use the Call Me feature in WebEx, you may enter the question queue by using the WebEx raise hand icon located just above the chat panel. You'll hear a beep tone when your line is unmuted. At that time, please state your name and question. If you're just on the phone line and not using the WebEx, please dial #2 on your phone to enter the question queue. You'll hear a notification when your line is unmuted. At that time, please state your name and question.
All right, well, hearing none, so I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Jimmy. But before that, I did want to thank stakeholders for participating today, and we look forward to reading your comments in the new year. So, Jimmy, I'll turn it over to you, and I think we can move to slide 40.
It's the next slide. There you go. Thanks, Danielle. And I do echo Danielle's sentiments. Thank you for your participation today. We are ending early, so have a great rest of your early afternoon. And we do welcome comments, as Danielle mentioned, after the new year. So we also wish you happy holidays until then. A lot of good discussion. And the next slide shows the upcoming schedule that we are laying out. And you can see the phased approach as mentioned. So you can look forward to us publishing the revised draft proposal after we receive your comments in January, after which we will incorporate the input after that and take up the phased approach from that point forward. So those dates so far are tentative, but you can look for the notice for the subsequent calls to be noticed around that time.
Jimmy, this is Bob.
Yeah, go ahead.
I see a chat that someone mentioned that January 3rd is a holiday. It's not for the ISO. We would observe the New Year's holiday on Friday the 31st. So is Monday, January 3rd, a holiday for others on the call?
Thanks, Bob, for clarifying that. Yeah, it's not a holiday for us. However, if anyone needs any extension requests, please just let us know and we'll be sure to work with you. So we're just trying to fit everything in.
Jimmy, sorry to interrupt here, but yeah. I do see a caller in the queue.
Oh, yeah, I just saw that too. Go ahead.
Sure. Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Yeah, hi, Jimmy. This is Susan Schneider. Hey, you know, January 3rd may or may not be a holiday for some people, but it is the first day back. And anyway, it might be, if we could get just even another day or two out of it. I know you're probably squeezed a little for time because the proposal was, you know, later than expected coming out, but it's going to be a little bit tough to get all that done over the holidays.
Yeah, that's good feedback. I mean, we're happy to extend it. We do have we have comments from other initiatives that whole first week coming back too, so we're trying not to scrunch you guys up as well. But yeah, that's
Thank you.
Definitely something we want to take into consideration. So
yeah, and I see you got the revised draft proposal on the 25th. So I mean, I know we understand there's a crunch on your end as well, but just even another couple of days would really be helpful.
Okay, yeah, we'll look into doing that. Thanks, Susan.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. We're trying not to scrunch you guys, and we're trying to also provide time for policy development as well. So we'll definitely cater to you on that to the extent we can. And just the next slide does show where to send comments. We hope to have a comments template published soon, so you can look for that to be up shortly. And again, we welcome comments, and at the very least, we'll look to extend them to the 4th, if not later. And with that, you can look forward to the recording, which as mentioned should be up in the next couple of business days. So have a great rest of your early day, folks.